Right now, the White House is the most famous address on the planet. Cameras are pointed at it around the clock, world leaders walk through its doors, and thousands of visitors tour it every single week. But a little over 200 years ago, this exact spot was nothing but muddy farmland on the edge of a swamp, with no city around it, no real roads, and no guarantee the whole project would even survive.
In this video, we are going all the way back to where it started and walking through the construction year by year.
Before we get to the construction, we need to answer one simple question. Why build a presidential mansion out here in the first place? And the answer goes back to a deal. For years, the young United States had no permanent capital, and the government basically moved from city to city. So in 1790, Congress passed the Residence Act, which settled the argument once and for all by placing a brand new capital along the Potomac River on land carved out of Maryland and Virginia. President George Washington took personal charge of the whole thing, and in 1791 he chose the exact site for the president's house himself. He wanted something permanent, something built of solid stone, and something that would tell the rest of the world this new republic was here to stay. To make it happen, the commissioners announced a national design competition in 1792, and an Irish-born architect named James Hoban won it with a neoclassical design inspired by Leinster House in Dublin. His reward was a $500 prize and the job of a lifetime. Now, with a design chosen and a site picked, the real work could finally begin. Construction officially kicked off in 1792, and it started with a problem. On July 19th, Hoban staked out the foundations while Washington's three commissioners watched, but the earlier city planner, Pierre L'Enfant, had imagined a palace several times bigger, and the cellars already dug into the ground swallowed up the footprint of Hoban's more modest house. Once that was sorted out, the famous moment arrived. On October 13th, 1792, workers laid the cornerstone in a Masonic ceremony, and the president's house was officially underway. But a design on paper does not lay itself. Crews built an encampment on the site for the workers, including barracks for the enslaved African Americans who would carry out much of the back-breaking labor. And here is a detail most people don't know. Hoban's original plan was for a grand 3-story building with more than 100 rooms, far larger than what stands there today. As you will see, money and reality would soon force that dream to shrink. With the cornerstone set, the next challenge was figuring out who would actually build the thing. By the spring of 1793, construction picked up speed, and almost immediately the commissioners hit a wall. They had planned to bring in skilled workers from Europe, but the response was dismal. The wages were low, and barely anyone showed up. So they turned to the labor force that would ultimately build the house. Enslaved African Americans, hired out from their owners across Maryland and Virginia, were put to work clearing land, cutting timber, making bricks, and hauling stone. And that stone is its own incredible story. About 40 miles south, on an island in Aquia Creek, sat a quarry of soft sandstone known as freestone, because it was so easy to cut. A Scottish master mason named Colin Williamson supervised the stonework and trained enslaved laborers right there at the quarry. Meanwhile, a Scottish merchant sailed all the way back to Scotland in late 1793 to recruit more skilled hands, because the Americans simply did not have enough of them, and that recruiting trip would pay off the very next year. In the summer of 1794, a group of Scottish stonemasons from a lodge in Edinburgh arrived in Washington, and they were so worried about breaking Britain's ban on skilled workers leaving the country that they sailed under false names. These were master craftsmen, and their fingerprints are still on the building today. Look closely, and you will find a delicate double rose carving, a Scottish symbol of homecoming, cut into the stone above the north door. That same year, the government set up a stone yard on the property, where enslaved workers and craftsmen shaped massive blocks that were then hoisted into place by tripod rigs. Slowly, the sandstone walls of the president's house began to climb out of the ground. After 2 years of clearing, digging, and hauling, you could finally see a building taking shape, and the momentum was about to carry it upward fast. Through 1795, those walls kept rising course by course, and the payrolls from this year give us one of the clearest windows into who was really doing the work. Records from May of 1795 list enslaved carpenters and sawyers by name, men like Peter, Ben, Harry, and Daniel, several of them owned by Hoban himself. Most unskilled laborers earned around 31 cents a day, working from sunrise to sunset in brutal heat and cold. This was the slow, grinding middle of the project, the kind of stretch that rarely makes the history books but carried the entire build on its back. And as the walls grew taller, the budget started telling a very different story. By 1796, reality was catching up with ambition. The money raised from selling city lots was not coming in fast enough, and the grand vision had to be trimmed down. Washington requested changes that actually cut the building's height, and during construction, the lower basement story was essentially dropped, shrinking the planned 3-story palace into the 2 main stories raised above the ground that we recognize today. He also called for those decorative rose and acorn carvings that give the stonework its character. It was a smaller house than Hoban first drew, but it was finally looking like the real thing. And then the labor force itself hit a turning point. In 1797, with funds running tight, the commissioners made a cold financial call. That November, they ordered that no more black carpenters or apprentices be hired at the public buildings, partly because Hoban's enslaved carpenters were earning nearly as much as the white apprentices, and his influence had started to fade. It was a stark reminder that this future symbol of liberty was being raised on deeply contradictory ground. Meanwhile, the exterior walls were essentially complete, which set up the single step that would give the house its name. In 1798, workers brushed the first coat of whitewash across the porous sandstone. A simple mix of lime and water meant to seal the stone and protect it from cracking in the freezing winters. But that practical coating had a side effect nobody planned for. The building turned a brilliant, glowing white, and people almost immediately started calling it the Whitehouse, long before that name ever became official. With the exterior sealed and the roof going on, the finish line was finally in sight. But the inside told a very different story. By 1799, the quarry that had fed this project for nearly a decade finally went quiet, and crews shifted indoors to plastering and finishing work. But the man who had driven the whole thing from the very beginning would never see it done. In December of 1799, George Washington died at Mount Vernon just months before the house was ready, which made him the one president who never got to live in the home he chose the ground for, shaped the design of, and fought to build. The job of moving in would fall to someone else. In 1800, after 8 long years, the president's house was just barely livable. Workmen rushed to plaster and paint, and on November 1st, President John Adams rolled up in his carriage and became the very first person to live there. The place was a mess. The grand staircase had been built, but the roof leaked and the rooms were cold and damp. His wife, Abigail Adams, arrived a couple of weeks later after getting lost on the unmarked country roads, and with no fence outside to hang a clothesline, she famously dried the family laundry in the enormous, unfinished East Room. All in, the house had cost about $232,000, a staggering sum for the time. And on his second night there, Adams wrote a line so fitting that Franklin Roosevelt later carved it into the state dining room mantel, a prayer that only honest and wise men would ever rule under its roof. After 8 years, materials hauled across 3 states, and the labor of hundreds of enslaved and free workers, America finally had a home for its president. John Adams lived in that house for less than 5 months before Thomas Jefferson took over. 8 years of sweat and sacrifice for a few short months of occupancy by the man who first walked through the door. But that was never really the point. The walls those Scottish masons and enslaved laborers raised would survive a British fire in 1814, get rebuilt by the very same architect, and stand through more than 2 centuries of history. Every single president since Adams has called it home. So the next time you see the White House on the news, remember that it started as muddy farmland and a $500 sketch, built stone by people whose names we are still working to recover.
If you enjoyed this reconstruction, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments which landmark I should rebuild next. Thank you, and I will see you in the next one.